Welcome to Conversations That Matter. As always, we start with an introduction from our associate Mike Manier. Mike, who's our guest today?
Stu, today we have Bill Gallagher. He's author of a book called Resource Rulers. Spent 30 years in the resource industry as a corporate lawyer, a regulator in Ottawa. He really talks about the winning record that First Nations and Aboriginal communities have in the courts in Canada when it comes to major resource projects. And he is saying that the game has completely changed, the ground has shifted, as we've seen in the Tsilhqot'in decision. And really, companies that want to have major resource projects anywhere in Canada, they need to build relationships with First Nations first. Don't depend on the government, don't depend on the courts, as sort of done in the past. And he's now being called upon with the Tsilhqot'in decision to counsel corporate leaders, legal communities, and the financial services industry about this whole concept of how do we work with First Nations effectively on major projects.
Well, in essence, he's basically saying the way that you did it before, do almost the exact opposite. You may not even have included First Nations in the past, and if so, they were always an afterthought almost. Now they have to become priority number one.
Well, that's absolutely right. And he also points to the fact that First Nations have had a tremendously successful winning record in the courts over the years. Major victories. Of course, the Tsilhqot'in decision, as we've seen, another major victory. So if you're assuming that you can win by outplaying the hand in the legal system and you're a company, bad wager. And an example that he gives, of course, is that the financial services industry, the banks, are on the leading edge of this. They are now really looking to companies and saying right up front, look, before we're going to be an investor, we want to see what kind of relationships have you built with the chief, with the council, with the First Nations that you're going to depend on for this project. Because if you haven't done that, you're not a good investment.
Well, I think it's also important to note that he says this doesn't mean that now the country is closed for business. He's just saying the model has changed and it has to be one of inclusion for everybody, especially including First Nations.
That's absolutely right, Stu. And he points to quite a few chiefs from First Nations that have endorsed his philosophy of coming together to the table rather than having that adversarial approach. And he notes a shift in sort of generational leadership within First Nations, that whole old approach of conflict and no for no's sake, well, that doesn't work either. And so you see a new generation of Aboriginal leaders that are saying, look, we will come to the table, we will work together, we want prosperity. We know that resource projects can be the link to prosperity, so let's make this work. So he paints actually a pretty positive picture, and of course, interesting to see how all of this unfolds in the years to come.
It was a very interesting conversation that we had with him in November 2014 when he was in Vancouver as a guest speaker with the Law Society. Let's go to that conversation now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've been impressed with the previous emissions, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity.
Well, it's interesting to get your perspective on where we're at. What does the lay of the land look like from your perspective when it comes to the management of resources in Canada as we move forward? Who's in charge?
The provinces are the principal resource owners right across the country, and in the north, the federal government devolves its jurisdiction to the Northern Territories. So in an odd sort of way, just when we need federal leadership the most, they're actually exiting the resources game, the management of resources. And that is putting small players like New Brunswick and big players like British Columbia having to chart their own course, and it's not working out for those two provinces as planned.
Well, they're having to chart their own course in a changing landscape as well. Court case after court case keeps changing the rules.
There's something happening now that we're approaching the 200 legal win mark by First Nations in the resources sector. I recently was at a forum where a senior federal official said, yes, Bill's right, they are resource rulers, they are gatekeepers, and they, if you don't have a constructive relationship with them, your project will go into limbo. And I said, I used to say that, but now your project will do a 180. And just to give you some very brief examples, the referendum on fracking in New Brunswick saw a premier lose his one-term opportunity. And in fact, we're going to see a fracking moratorium, the exact opposite outcome. And over here at Tsilhqot'in's New Prosperity Mine, where you had an approval go down federally, you now have a totem pole sitting on the mine shaft that basically indicates that, no further dialogue need transpire. This is terra incognito. This is Indian land.
Right.
So you're seeing these
Chief
180s.
Joe Alphonse says that, and he said that on this show. As far as he's concerned, nothing's going to happen there.
Well, to your credit, you have brought on key public influencers who are giving you and giving your audience the straight goods on just what the margins are, how slim they are, and this 180-degree syndrome that I see happening. When your mayor, when the city put out a proclamation that it's on unceded land, all of these things that I'm talking about, the totem pole, the fracking 180, these were all unforeseen 3 months ago.
We'll get right back to that in just a moment. We'll be right back after these messages. Let's just talk about this. The mayor comes out and publicly declares that we are on unceded First Nations territory. Now, he's not doing it in a court of law, but he's doing it in the court of public opinion. How much weight is that going to carry as we move forward? Can we go back from this declaration that he has now made?
It is a legal instrument put out by the largest urban government in the Lower Mainland. As a strategist, here's what it signifies. He is throwing his lot in with the First Nations in terms of whatever the social license equities are. Those First Nations are strongly already aligned with eco-activists who are pushing a very strong agenda. And these projects are now finding out that the kite of the tail involves eco-activist First Nations, and geez, look at this, a declaration at the very highest level by the city of Vancouver. The alignments are very, very powerful, and in the current environment, if you're going up against First Nations and eco-activists, both of whom are empowered, backed up by a major municipal government, the odds of your project happening are slim.
When we take a look at the agenda of an eco-activist and we see them align themselves with a First Nation that might be the one that's affected by a particular project, are they hijacking a First Nations agenda, or do you believe that they are in harmony with the needs of the First Nation? And this is something that I'm not sure of the answer. And
well, I'm skeptical,
asking the question.
and I note a certain degree of skepticism. It's a fair question. The last great resource play that saw an alignment of First Nations and eco-activists happened in Northern Ontario in the Ring of Fire very recently. And that has ended in the Liberal government, the McGuinty government, proclaiming half of Northern Ontario, putting it into an environmental protection zone, the Protection of the Far North Act. The alliance between First Nations and eco-activists ruptured. The First Nations then realized that they weren't going to have control over half of their traditional lands because of this piece of legislation. And they felt that they had been had. And now the Ring of Fire has gone into even more turmoil, such that I believe the eco-activist movement has left the First Nations movement standing at the altar in Northern Ontario. And the ramifications are still playing out. And they're not good for the economy of Ontario and not good for the Canadian resources sector. So I'm just saying there is an objective storyline that would show that the altruistic values are not a natural fit. They can be allies by convenience. There may be some of that happening out here, but out here as well with the urban declaration, there is more of a eco-activist legitimacy and headspace. And I come along counting court cases. I treat anybody who wins as legitimate. They're playing by the rules, they've gone to court, they've put their arguments forward. So if Suzuki wins one, he's entirely legitimate in my books.
And when we take a look at the record of wins, anybody that's associated with the First Nations case is looking pretty good for them.
It's looking very good, but these projects don't come back.
No, they don't.
And if the idea was to not to cut environmental corners, which is the way we should be running the country anyway, we shouldn't be cutting environmental corners.
Right.
And if they're wanting to get a piece of the action on plays right in their backyard, and if it becomes too much for a proponent to bear the fallout, yes, everybody loses. But so my big message is these First Nations court cases have to be commercialized. Mm-hmm. They have to be brought into the mainstream so everybody, it's not enough to win in court.
Right. Now, you're not saying having First Nations involved in the development of resources is a bad thing. It's a question of how are we going to approach this and how are we going to make it work to everybody's benefit, First Nations included. Do I have that right?
It's even stronger. Having First Nations involved in resources is not only a good thing, it's the only way you're going to bring those resources on within a reasonable project window of opportunity.
And if one of those resources is the First Nations community itself, is that not an important investment for anybody who's involved in the resource sector?
Clearly, the concept of bringing First Nations on board is through these joint venture vehicles or impact benefit agreements. That's jobs, training, and equity participation. I come along and say, First Nations have that. I mean, you're not giving a First Nation anything in 2014 saying, we'll talk these three parameters. They're going to treat that as the floor.
As was laid out in the Tsilhqot'in case.
Exactly, that's what you're finding out. That's presumably what Joe Alphonse would tell you. And I actually agree with their thinking. All the templates of what brought on Voisey's Bay or worked in various other mines, they're all way in the past.
So what does the new model look like? If I'm looking at investing in the resource sector here in Canada, how do I shape a deal that is going to pass all levels of review, including First Nations? How do I structure that?
The number one plane ticket you should buy is the plane ticket that Jim Prentice has been buying since he became Premier, and that's going into these First Nations communities that have been, basically declaring that they're in the driver's seat and showing them respect. That's what he's doing. That's what a CEO has to do. If a CEO can't then bring that First Nation leader to their banker, the reality is the bankers have figured this out. They will not be lending money to major resource proponents just because some corner office lawyer says we've done sufficient consultation and we don't have to do more, and if we have to duke it out in court, we will. Bankers have moved on. The market has moved on. I maintain there's a whole bunch of bereft corner office lawyers that have to get with the program because their clients have realized there's a different order of magnitude at play here.
Let's hang on to that thought for just a sec and come back to it after these messages. We'll be right back. So I find it interesting that you say step number one is come and meet them in a spirit of cooperation and respect. That's not even talking about the deal.
That's right. And that's why everybody, it wasn't that long ago I was out here to a Vancouver Board of Trade, and I basically said, I've worked on a major project where we went and asked for First Nations consent. And right at the table in front of me were some companies that were in the blender, and I could see all the arms crossing. Well, I'm saying consent is your answer. Consent is your ticket into earning respect, and that's the other key word. You don't just get consent, you have to earn consent. And that's what we're seeing here with the change in the dynamics, and that's why so many of the legal profession are ill-equipped to change their stripes, because in some respects their legal toolbox is out of gas.
I feel like I have to bring this into the discussion because it has to do with the history of First Nations in Canada. How important is it that when you go to a First Nations leader and you start to deal with them, that you understand what their journey has been over the last couple hundred years here in Canada? Like, you can't just say the past is the past. So, what role does comprehending First Nations journey through Confederation to today?
Well, you have a brilliant example here, right, in the person of Sean Atleo, who's on the comeback trail quite properly. He personally has won 2 recent appellate-level rulings on a commercial fishery for 5 First Nations, the Nuchalnuf, off the west coast. But he hasn't been prioritizing that, even though you'd think that would be the biggest drum he'd bang, because he has got a different issue to address his constituency on education. So when you go in as a proponent, you have to realize that your stack of binders, and you wouldn't produce them in the first meeting, is a major anchor on the other issues facing the Native leadership. You have to help them, and hopefully they will help you. This is reciprocity. This is the number one issue, is reciprocity. The politicians have to become statesmen, and we're starting to see some of that. I call it reactive statesmanship. The Premier, I think, is out there doing very, very good overtures, but she's doing it because she ran up against a wall. You have to wonder whether she'd be doing the same things, the apologies, if in fact the First Nations didn't, sweep the floor with her Department of Justice, okay, which is what's happened here. But there are other politicians. There's one, Thomas Mulcair, I believe, is out there doing proactive statesmanship, saying he's got answers that he's going to put in as leader of the opposition, major steps forward, a secretariat right in the PMO, right on day one, to work on treaties, this sort of stuff. But there are very, very few statesmen coming at this naturally. The only proponents who are going to even be in the game in this line of work are those that can play that role and use their hired help and their investors and their bankers to say, hey, this can work, but everything that we thought was the way to go is not what we're going to do. It's an entirely new road.
Well, we'll come back to that in just a moment. We'll just take a break here for a couple of commercial messages. We'll be right back. When we had Minister Rustad on, he was trying to suggest that it's going to be business as usual. Why would he want to go there when in fact the landscape has changed so much? Why is it important to him to say it's business as usual?
Well, I guess he's trying to indicate that to markets and to keep the resources sector, which is under serious stress, that geez, what's not business as usual? Like, they're not going to stop things, right? So I've got a theory that it's the Native legal winning streak that has pacified and subdued those tensions by having more common sense access provisions that ranchers and landowners can now get access to the court, such that business as usual had to stop.
A lot of people are not going to like hearing that.
This country, and the reason I wrote this book, and the reason I'm on a 200 native legal wind tour is to say, we've turned the corner. We're out of options. Your Premier has figured that out. The Alberta Premier has figured that out. They need serious federal help.
Do they need also corporate and citizen help as well?
All statesmen should step forward. And I'm going to give a nod to Pierre LaBelle at Imperial Metals. He took a day off of a pretty hectic period to play the corporate statesman role at a legal education seminar today.
So this is something that we all play a role in.
If we want to maintain our lifestyle and have a vibrant resources sector, don't forget my mantra is pro-business, no environmental shortcuts, none, and joint ventures with First Nations every step of the way.
And then we will have a healthy economy.
You'll have a healthier economy, and you'll you know, there are various numbers of communities in this province. Some of them live on reserves, let's say 350, and some of them occupy the top floor stories of a tower down here called a law firm. Okay, which one do you want to feed? Okay, if you're a proponent, you could either have the 350 people on the reserve in your boat singing your praises and have a shot of the project, or have these guys fighting with those 350 people and not have a project, and not have them in your boat, and not having them return your calls when it all goes south. Simple math. Those are your options. You have no other. You're at a turning point.
It's going to change the nature of Canada.
It should change the nature of Canada. First Nations are resource rulers. They've earned it, and we have to earn their consent to work with them.
And they have a right to be a part of Canadian society.
That's right, and let's hopefully we can get them to look fondly upon us, because the way these court cases have run out, they could be snarly if they wanted to.
That's what I thought when I first started this project. When I first started going down this path, we're going to wind up in a position where they have the power, they know it, and they're going to say bye-bye. But I'm not getting that sense from anybody. They're all saying, okay, good, now we're at the table, let's do business.
To me, hearing you say that, Stu, is the number one reason why I'm proud to be on your show and why your show is relevant. You are finding the common ground and the voices in a sea of talking heads.
Well, it looks to me like there's a real willingness on First Nations to say, now I want you to recognize that I can be a full-fledged participant, and let's roll up our sleeves and get going.
That's right. And let's show us you can do it in BC, you know. Then we'll have some maybe a new breath of fresh air in Ontario and the Maritimes, where literally nothing has happened.
But it's going to have to take a non-Aboriginal societal mind shift. We have to start to embrace people from First Nations communities the way that we are inviting the rest of the world to come and be part of Canadian society. And we haven't done that, and we still haven't done it yet, which I find very confusing.
Well, take the argument out of the hands of the technocrats, the legal talking heads, who have been running the show up till now, who have been racking up this ridiculous losing streak, and find your statesmen, bring them on your show, and keep doing what you're doing. I think the people you have had on are, by the way, if there's 12 statesmen in this province, you've had half of them on, so you've done your bit.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming on the show. Appreciate it.